this is again one of our first 10 slides for the week of April 6th through the 10th that you needed to go ahead and complete. I believe this is the very first one that we were going to start discussing for 20th century. So the name of this one is called Demoiselles de Avignon. It's by Pablo Picasso. This is done in 1907, oil on canvas. And what the title actually translates to is The Young Ladies of Avignon. This is roughly about, if you look at the composition itself, this is close to an 8 by 8 foot size canvas, so it's another square shaped canvas. And Pablo Picasso, again, for every one of these slides, we're going to be talking about a new movement. He is specifically in the phase called Cubist movement. And specifically, we're going to be looking at a particular type of cubist further on as we explore called analytical cubism when we look at George Braque's Portuguese later on. So a little bit about Pablo Picasso is he's Spanish. He's painting this though when he's in Paris. And where the name comes from the title, it's a famous street in Barcelona. It's in a red light district, which he actually frequently visited and when he was studying at the art academies there. And basically, this is kind of indicating somewhat of like a brothel. And so before we get into talking a little bit about this piece, I need for you to just do me a quick favor because I'm going to be referencing all the women that are being portrayed, and I'm going to give you a little bit of info for each of them. So if you can, for right now, if you can go to your slide, put this woman that's on the far left, put her as number 1. This lady is going to be number 2. This lady right in the center is number 3, number 4 on top, and number 5. Okay, I just want you to put those numbers because I'm going to reference that in a little bit, and I just want to make sure that we have a clear understanding. So basically, before we get into talking a little bit about this piece, we just kind of need to focus on what we're still paying attention to, and obviously we're still seeing the subject matter of a female painted nude. Now, we're not seeing her completely be reclined. However, there is some speculation about figure number 2, and we'll talk a little bit about that and how she's being portrayed and depicted as maybe she is actually laying in a bed. She's not necessarily standing, however, we do see her standing. But we're seeing that, again, that traditional of the ideals of beauty being challenged. So he's using these female nudes and he puts them in traditional poses, especially in number 2 and number 3. This is number 2 and this is number 3. Similar to how we saw kind of like how in Titian, Venus of Albino, real quick, if we look at Venus of Albino, Titian, we see a little bit of some similarities in the way that they have their bodies being portrayed, the way that they're kind of standing somewhat in that same kind of an aspect. We're seeing that, but he's breaking the rules of the female nude and how they're supposed to be soft and beautiful and very curving and passive and sensual and desirable. We're no longer seeing that. Okay, so that is completely off the table. So just to mention a couple things about each of these, let's just go into doing our number scheme real quick. If you can put for number 1, just some information about the woman that's on the left. Her face is in profile, and you can see how the way that you only see one of her eyes, she's in a frontal position, so you can only see one of her eyes being visible. Um, for number 2, figure lady number 2, I kind of just was talking about it earlier. We kind of see a little bit of the asymmetrical standing, our contrapposto standing. Her face is a little lopsided. Is she standing or is she lying down from above? If you looked at the video for this particular one, it actually is showing how the perspective of this particular woman, she could be actually reclining, laying down. So we're not too sure about where he was going with this particular woman. For number 3, we do see both of her eyes, so she is looking frontal at us. Her nose is in profile though, so if you notice that. So we do see it from the sides, and also both of her ears are visible. These particular two, for number 2 and number 3, they're inspired by prehistoric Iberian sculptures. So just going back to some of the ancients, some of the classics. I don't think I had any other, no, I didn't have any other references. So just specifically looking at these two in particular. This one is actually also being influenced as well, and you can kind of see that with this particular prehistoric sculpture as well. So continuing on, these two over here on the side, we just need to discuss a little bit. Both of them, you can even classify for number 4 and number 5. For number 4, though, more specifically, um, we see some. Oh, okay, sorry. For number 4 and 5, let me just say this. We see their faces not being traditionally depicted, like how we saw in 1, 2, and 3. If you notice, Picasso was actually really much inspired by African masks. So we're going to see those being used in these particular two depictions of these women's faces. And we can even see the use of the parallel lines specifically going on. It's referring to the scarification. And if you remember us studying about that with the African masks and the importance of the scarification. So we're seeing that being used. And then for this bottom one in particular, she's actually squatting from behind, but we can see her face from the front. So we're seeing multiple vantage points. And that's like the whole concept of cubism, which we're going to be getting into a little bit more. And again, so these particular two heads are being referenced by African mask, which Picasso was fascinated and he actually started to collect. And we talked a little bit about some of the parallel lines being attributed on the actual faces themselves relating to scarification. So this particular painting is probably one of the most boldest and most influential paintings of the early 20th century. And again, we're looking at this particular type of movement, and Picasso is going to be one of our founders, and it's called the Cubist movement. This is almost like a revolution. And by the later decades of the 19th century, more and more artists are going to, again, rebel against the traditional art, and this is going to help keep the minds of the conventions of the European painting. It helps to keep in mind the conventions of the European painting since the Renaissance. So we're seeing much of tradition going on up until this point, and now we're starting to see artists move away from, the painterly, the academia, and we're starting to see this use of cubism, the use of multiple perspectives, and that's what we're going to kind of get into discussing. So basically, this is a picture bounded two-dimensional surface. It acts as a window into an imaginary world beyond that surface, where we see 3D objects that are convincingly portrayed, usually in one-point perspective and with gradual shading from light to dark. We would see some sort of use of illusion of some solidarity. And for this particular one, we're seeing more recognizable figures, easily more recognizable figures. So beginning with Monet, if you go back to Monet in the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, they're going to start to chip away from these expectations of being very painterly and beautiful. And if you remember in Monet, this was Monet. He begins to emphasize the flatness of the canvas. Again, we talked about how her color, how we're not seeing a lot of shading. It's not as appealing as when we've looked at other female nudes, especially Titian, okay, and Venus of Arbino. Then we're also looking at another artist, which we've also studied, is Gauguin. Let me go to Gauguin. He's going to start to explore the use of color and the use of color being associated with emotion and expression to imitate natural appearance. And then we got our last guy to just discuss for a second is Cezanne. He's going to, again, be simplifying objects into more abstract shapes, which we were discussing when we were talking about this for our spring break slide, where we see multiple vantage points within the same painting. So by the turn of the 20th century, we're seeing to the point where we're seeing this use of progressive artists, moving away from the tradition, and they're trying to basically move away from the reality of intimate in nature. That's basically going bankrupt, it's going dead. So with this painting, Picasso is radically defying tradition. He's opening up a new kind of movement, again, this form of visual experimentation, and how that's going to be followed by other artists. Um, Picasso at a very young age, before he was even talking, he was already being classified as a child prodigy. He was already drawing before he could talk. He was completely skilled in traditional art at a young age, but he spent his entire life restlessly exploring other ways to depict the visual world. So we're seeing him studying. Oh, and when he does his large paintings, we're just about all the way to the end. When we start to see him study these very large paintings, he'll often, with his paintings, encompass drafts, if you will, like various studies. So I just wanted to kind of show you originally what his piece was supposed to include, because there's two other figures in here that we got to talk about that are not actually included in the final scene. So in this particular scene, we just need to mention a couple things. Originally he had studied where he had intended for this to be in a brothel, and initially there were 5 women and 2 men. They were the clients. And what is now a woman in the middle was originally a sailor. So this guy right here. And there was another guy that was walking in. He was also on the left side. He was classified as a medical student. And I know you can't really see it in this particular one or this one, but they discussed it in the con video for this particular one. He's supposed to be holding a skull, which is referring to, for art, if you ever see a skull being symbolized, it's supposed to resemble art, or excuse me, resemble death. So that is supposed to be how the original painting was. And the use of space is the next thing we just kind of need to discuss quickly about, is the use of interaction with the space in the background. Is how the foreground and the background are pretty much all together. You don't really see any use of depth going on. And then I think that's part of like the distortion of the human figure, and how it's trying to be depicted. There's supposed to be kind of like a sheet behind a curtain. However, the way that the curtain's being depicted, the way that the women are standing, it's almost like it's completely flat. You don't see that use of depth or the use of space by any light or tonal or any kind of like depiction of such. So the use of space is pretty much being blurred out from the foreground to the background. And then with that, the light is being fragmented into multiple sources. So you're seeing this, again, this is kind of defining the characteristics of Cubism, of the observers with various points of view constantly shifting. With this being a revolutionary approach to space, again, discussing about the foreground, background kind of blurring in, we're seeing the use of space being represented and best expressed with the challenge of traditional classical ideal of beauty and harmony since the Middle Ages. That's where we're going back. So that really kind of ties into this particular painting. Again, this was done by Picasso. When he had friends come over that were various painters, art buyers, art critics, they were all very shocked at first. Even George Baroque, which we're going to be getting into very soon with the Portuguese, who, again, was part of the collaboration with Cubism. He even made a comment saying, for the first time when he saw this, it was like drinking kerosene. So again, just the use of Cubism being the forte, being the foreground for this particular one. Make sure you have that for your notes. Okay, this is gonna conclude us for this one. Over and out.